Mr. Mark Reckless.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And it is a pleasure to speak on this bill introduced by the honourable member for Eltham, and indeed on this side of the House. And it's a particular pleasure and respect to the honourable member for Eltham, because I've spent some of the past few weeks defending myself against allegations from the party opposite that I grew up in his constituency with an SE9.
You should be proud.
Indeed, I am proud, and many people in my own constituency have moved down from Eltham and surrounding areas, and I'm delighted to return me to this House in the early hours of this morning. I also found a very compelling speech that the honourable gentleman made, and it was actually at 4:30 or thereabouts this morning that I was extolling myself the virtues of the Levellers and the Chartists, and I can only think I had a premonition of the speech that he was to make in the House this morning. Now, the other reason I'm here is because in the by-election I've just fought, we had in Nashaba Khan, a Labour candidate, who made, I thought, quite eloquently the case against fragmentation and privatisation of the NHS. And she and others in Medway Labour promoted to me this bill that was going to be put forward today. Yes, I will.
I'm grateful to the honourable member for giving way. And would he agree with me on that very point about fragmentation? Last night I wasn't in Rochester. I was joining the vigil outside of Parliament from the groups that are campaigning to save our NHS. But I had a conversation with a consultant oncologist on this very issue of fragmentation. And he said the only competition we should have in the NHS is the competition to defeat disease. Are you in agreement with that?
I think that sounds a good statement, and I have a certain degree of scepticism myself what the honourable member for Southport was saying about sort of internal markets in the NHS and other public services, and I think it tends to depend very much on the circumstances of the service provided, and I think an ideological predisposition either against or in favour of internal markets is probably not wise. I was saying in terms of this bill and the Labour candidate opposing fragmentation and privatisation of the NHS, and indeed this bill appearing to do so. And I discovered that this was now the Labour Party position, because I had assumed that the Labour Party was in favour of privatisation and fragmentation in the NHS, because that was my understanding of what the record had been. I will give way again.
I'm very grateful for giving way. Well, perhaps he'd like to clarify for the House, the benefit of the House, whether his party is actually in favour of a private insurance-backed approach to healthcare, or does it actually believe in the NHS? Which is it? Was it a premonition of this morning, or where are we with it?
Yeah. My party believes in the NHS, in a service free at the point of delivery. My father is a doctor. My mother is a nurse. It is core to my values, and it is core to the values of my party. No, that is our policy. Our policy is determined by our party, and it is to support an NHS free at the point of delivery. Well, I think there may have been an answer to a question 2 years ago, which is now taken out of context. And our party, not quite like the Liberal Democrats with their federal policy executive, but we have formal measures for making policy, and UKIP has decided, I will continue if I may. I will allow
I thank the honourable gentleman for giving way, and although I don't agree with him on many things, I do welcome him back to the House. He was talking about the history of the evidence. According to the House of Commons Library, he might be interested to know that the amount of money spent by NHS England on buying in healthcare from outside the NHS went from £1.1 billion in 97-98 to £7.5 billion in 2009-10. Those are the facts according to the Library.
Yes, indeed, the honourable member is correct, and there was a great deal of privatisation and indeed fragmentation of the NHS under Labour. I'm not denying there's been further under the current government, and I think it's a problem which has afflicted both main parties. I'll continue for a bit if I may. Now, I will continue for a bit if I may. And where I see this from the local perspective is we have in Darrants Valley a hospital that was, as far as I can see, sort of privatised under Labour, and one of the most disastrous PFIs the NHS has seen. And we then have in Medway, now Medway Foundation Trust, we have a hospital that became a foundation trust on the basis of largely a box-ticking exercise and one that focused on financials, but appeared to ignore the fact that by that stage the standardised mortality rate at that hospital was some 10% above the norm. 1 in 10 more patients were dying than should be expected. I give way, yes.
I'm grateful to the member for giving way. I know he's had a late night last night, but I wonder whether or not he can address what his party's view is in terms of the health service in Scotland.
We've clarified the view of my party in general on the NHS. I'm afraid I'm not yet in a position to give detail on the Scottish particular policy, although I'd be very happy to go away and seek to assist the honourable gentleman at another time. But we had in Medway this fragmentation. We have a hospital that was cut loose by the Department of Health and is essentially run by an independent board. So when there are these problems, when it's in special measures, there is now the potential for greater intervention. But we have in Monitor what appears to be really a backstop regulator, not a regulator that was really able to come in and run the hospital and turn it around. It can perhaps sort of get rid of the chair and the chief executive, but it isn't actually there to make constructive improvements. So I will continue if I may. So that foundation trust situation and the independence those hospitals have, the inability of this House or the Secretary of State then to drive improvements in the hospitals, and the decisions to allow them to become foundation trusts despite a situation where 1 in 10 people more were dying than should be the case, is, I think, an indictment of policy under the previous government. And I was delighted to hear from the Labour candidate I've been facing in recent weeks that Labour is now against privatisation and fragmentation of the NHS. I welcome the bill that the Honourable Member for Eltham has brought in today, and I'm pleased to support it. I give way.
I welcome support from all quarters for my bill, but why should anyone believe him? Does he accept that the government were elected with no mandate to introduce the 2012 Act, and he voted for it? So why now should people believe what he's saying on the NHS?
Well, I think that is probably correct, and I may be guilty of believing what the undertakings I was given by the front bench opposite, and in particular, I give way again.
I think it might be helpful for the honourable member to bear in mind the words of his colleague on those benches, when the honourable member for Clacton said, "Never one to slavishly support the party line. I would be quite prepared to oppose these reforms, the 2012 Act, if I felt they were a step back, but I won't. These changes are necessary, and contrary to much of the mainstream media coverage, in my experience, they're quietly supported by many doctors too." Does he support what his colleague has said, or does he not?
And I think my honourable friend for Clacton is certainly right that there are some doctors who supported this. And early in the stages of the bill, there seemed to be actually a number of the representative bodies that did, or at least were represented as supporting it. But as the bill went through, it seemed that some of that support from organisations like the BMA that had been claimed seemed to fall away. The bill, now the Act, I think 460 pages it was described as. And the problem was how legislation is made in this House. In the coalition agreement, a Business of the House committee was promised. Yet the time and the allocation to it is not done by that committee. We have a committee of selection which is run by the usual channels on the whips on the either side of the House, and people with expertise, such as the honourable member for Totnes, who might actually have improved this bill, were excluded from the committee. Now, I've listened to the honourable member for Eltham and some of the points that he has made. I give way once more.
I did feel it important to perhaps further the quote that I've just given the honourable gentleman, which was made actually after much of the committee stage of the bill. And the honourable member for Clacton went on to say, and this was on the 11th of February 2012 on his talkcarswell.com website, if these proposals were defeated, it would be a setback for all of us who would like to see public service reform. We need to keep our nerve. Now that rather contradicts what he's just said, does it not?
It's an excellent website, www.talkcarswell.com, and I would recommend it to all colleagues. And it was said when most of the bill committee stage had happened. So was this in the pause that had been invented, a sort of new mechanism for Parliament? I mean, I think my honourable friend, he's not here at the moment, but I think he would agree with me that this bill has not been, this Act is not as it was billed to us by the opposition front bench. And it has actually just led to an extraordinary degree of additional complexity in the NHS, and the introduction of competition bodies, and particularly European competition law, into the NHS is not welcome. We have also seen... No, I'm going to continue for a bit, but if I may. I'm not giving way at this moment. I wanted to speak about 3 points in particular about the Honourable Member's bill. First, Section 75, and I don't think this was apparent to the Honourable Member for Clacton any more than other members of the House, although there may have been some on this side who had premonitions of it. But the extent of the difficulties which doctors and others have found because of Section 75 and the bureaucratic, market-based commissioning or quasi-market-based commissioning rules that are required. Because actually what I thought that the Bill and Now Act was intended to do was to allow these different local bodies to get on with running the NHS in their areas, and some would run it better than others, and there would be local decision-making and discretion, and people would learn from each other. But actually then there are these centrally determined rules that force everyone into particularly commissioning or contracting behaviour that don't make sense for the particular... I will continue if I may. That don't make sense for the particular service that is being delivered. I give way to the Honourable Member for Shipley.
I'm very grateful to him, and can I first of all congratulate him on his victory last night in the by-election, and what was an excellent result for him. And it would be churlish not to point that out, Madam Deputy Speaker. But I know the honourable gentleman has always been a long-standing supporter of localism and a belief in localism. Is he not at all concerned about this bill, which the BMA themselves is concerned that actually gives much more wider powers to the Secretary of State, and in that sense will be centralising powers, taking away the day-to-day running of the NHS away from clinical staff and putting it in the hands of a Secretary of State? Is he not worried about that as a champion of localism?
I'm grateful for the honourable members' congratulations, and it's very, very decent of him. I'm not a fan of quasi-autonomous bodies and great amounts of overlapping regulators and different layers of bureaucracy. I feel they rarely work, and the degree of complexity that has now been brought into the NHS is that I think it's at least possible, I'm not certain, but possible that the centralisation of power in a single Secretary of State, at least accountable to this House, might be better than the current diffusion of fragmentation of powers, which doesn't seem to be working effectively. What we would like to do in my party is to replace that alphabet soup of regulators and these overlapping layers of bureaucracy with a single elected health board for each county area, which I think would give a degree of clarity to oversight and management of the NHS.
On that point, will give way.
I will give way once more, and I will then pursue the remainder of my speech, if I may.
I'm grateful for him giving way once again, and he's been very good in that respect, but can he just say why he doesn't actually believe that the health boards should be taken back into the local authorities in order that there is that democratic ticket, rather than a stand-alone vote for health boards?
I think there is an argument for that, and a judgment has to be made, and it may be possible that, depending on different areas of countries, and particularly involved administrations, that the solution to that may be different. My general view is that it is much better to have democratic accountability than not to have it, and in many areas I would prefer that to be local, and certainly for my party what we want to see is elected health boards on a county basis. We also want to see competition law, European competition law, taken out of the NHS, and I think what is put in the bill is exemplary in this way, and I would strongly support it. And finally, on the TTIP issue, I have signed a pledge along with most other candidates in the election, except for the Conservative one. Not the Liberal one, that's not a good one to sign, although I did vote against tuition fees along with most people on this side of the House. What I would like to see is, one, the NHS excluded from TTIP. I think there are arguments as to whether it may be or not, but I think those arguments should be settled in this House, as per this bill Andrew Willie put forward, rather than left to the unpredictability of future legal actions. I also believe, I'm just reaching a conclusion if I may, I also believe that TTIP, as it's been described, and I think the Honourable Member for Eltham made a mistake by talking about the UK negotiating TTIP, is an area of exclusive exclusive competence for the European Community, and therefore it's the EU Commission that negotiates this with the United States, is when I first heard of TTIP, it sounded sort of about free trade, and I thought it was broadly a good thing. But the more I looked into it, it seemed that it wasn't about free trade, but it was the creation of a single set of regulations agreed on a transnational basis by the US and the European Union, with which, if you did not comply, it would be illegal then to sell goods and services. So I'm very sceptical of TTIP. I'm not sure it is something I would want to support, and I certainly don't want to see the NHS included in it. I would like to congratulate the honourable member for Eltham on his bill, and I look forward to supporting it in the lobbies.